Good evening, members of council, ladies and gentlemen, staff. I see that we have quorum, and I call this special meeting for the town of Pelham council to order. I have some opening remarks regarding development charges public meeting, but I need to adopt the agenda first. Thank you. It's been moved by Councillor Ribbiak, second by Councillor Durley, that be it resolved the agenda for the June 13th, 2018 special meeting of council be adopted as circulated. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. The next item is disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof. That is any conflicts of interest that any members of council may have. Do any members have any conflicts? No, Mr. Mayor. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Can that be so noted by the clerk? Now we'll officially begin. As I mentioned, I have some opening remarks regarding the development charges public meeting. Tonight, council is holding a public meeting under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act. The purpose of this meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the 2018 development charges background study. This study calculates new development charges for wastewater, water, highway-related, fire protection, outdoor recreation, indoor recreation, library, and administrative services. Prior to receiving public comments this evening, we'll ask our consultant, Gary Scanlon of Watson and Associates, to provide a brief presentation of the findings of the study. There's also a sign-up sheet here on the right, your left. For those that are interested in receiving information, please sign in. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Scanlon. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. I've got a brief presentation, or I guess for me brief, and then we'll talk about what's included in the background study that we've filed on your behalf.
Okay.
This is just a quick overview of the process that we've been having with staff, so that we've been meeting with them since March, going through the growth forecast, taking a look at the capital projects, updating the lists, and then considering policy matters that we may incorporate into the bylaw, and then that's led us to the point where we released the May 17th background study. Background study must be out a minimum 60 days now. There's a change because of Bill 73. So now they want a longer period of time for the public to be able to review the document. So everything we've done to date, we're well within the time periods that have been identified. The mayor's indicated this is a process identified under the Development Charges Act. And as I've noted, we've met the 60-day requirement. So today, at the end of this evening, council will not be passing a bylaw. They'll just be receiving comments or receiving information from you. You've already kind of outlined it's a process where I'll do some background presentation. Members of the public can make any statements or ask questions, and then council, and subsequently close the meeting. DCs are not new. They've been around for about 60 years now. They used to be called lot levies when they were originally prepared under the Planning Act. And since 1989, we have what's called the Development Charges Act. These charges are generally in addition to what developers will pay for directly as part of their subdivision. So the developers normally responsible for what's referred to in the Act as local service. Mm-hmm. So internal roads, internal sidewalks, water mains, street lights, sewers, and there may be some adjacent road improvements and such. So these are normally included as part of the developer responsibility, and we have outlined that information within the I think it's Appendix E within this document. Just to be clear, so we don't include 100% of all the infrastructure. The developers will pay for more of the localized, and the DEC picks up the broader costs. As I've noted, the development charge has been around for a while. There have been adjustments to the Act over time, and in 1997, they made a number of adjustments so that the charges that we calculate are no longer full cost recovery. So the capital costs associated with growth, because there's a number of reductions, deductions, service limitations, service standards, we collect about 75 to 80% of the cost of growth. And as you can see, this is one area. I'll go through a couple of areas for you as background, but you can see there's a number of exclusions now, services we can't collect for. So headquarters for the general administration of the municipality, basically a town hall for the most part. We've lost all the arts, cultural, museum-related services. There's a notation there for entertainment services. It's never been quite defined, but it is commented on in the Act. Tourism facilities, including economic development, making contributions to hospitals, which we used to do. Parkland acquisition is limited to what you get under the Planning Act. We can't top up anymore. All other services, eligible services, we can buy land, but just not for parkland. We can put in money to develop it, you know, put in the trees, the landscaping, the swing sets, stuff like that. We just can't buy the land for that particular service. And then vehicles and equipment must meet a test on average of lasting 7 years or longer. So what they want is the larger, more substantial equipment. They don't want things like hammers and weed whippers and that type of thing. When we go through the calculations, we identify the amount, type, and location of growth. Most of the services are limited to a 10-year planning horizon, but we can go longer for water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, and fire. So we have this longer planning horizon that we look at, the servicing needs. We identify the servicing needs to accommodate the growth, and generally that translates into capital projects, capital costs. And when we have those costs, then there's a number of deductions. If there's any grant subsidies and other contributions, they get reduced. There's not a lot these days. When the 1997 Act was put into place, we had 50% grants for roads, 75% for transit, 15% for water and wastewater, 5% for recreation. After this local service realignment process that the government of the day went through, eliminated all of the, for the most part, most of the grants. Must consider benefit to existing. So if there's any works that are basically accommodating an existing problem, which could be water deficiencies or problems with sewers, or if you're replacing a building or an asset, then we must turn our minds to identifying a benefit to the existing, and that becomes a deduction. There's a statutory 10% deduction, so the soft services, we get to the end of the calculations, and then there's a mandatory reduction. So that doesn't apply to the water, wastewater, storm, roads, police, fire, but everything else, there's a 10% deduction which must be made up generally from property taxes. There's historic service standard calculations, that's in Appendix B, so what we charge development in the future can be no higher than the average level of service been provided in the community. That doesn't apply when we're looking at water, wastewater, and storm, because the environmental regulations or legislation override this requirement, but for the most part, all the other services we have to consider that. And then lastly, we have DC reserve funds, which we have to rationalize moving from one bylaw to the next. We end up, after all of those adjustments, we have a net capital cost. The Act says we must identify the benefit of those works between residential and non-residential, and then we divide it by the growth in order to come up with the charges. We have low, medium, and high residential charges, and normally non-residential is represented on a cost per square foot. So you build a certain size, you're charged by the size of the building times the charge. Recently, we've gone through another revision to the Development Charges Act. It's Bill 73 in 2015. It became effective on Jan 1, 2016. Couple of, I've noted where the adjustments have been made. Ineligible services, this is minor, but it could be major over time. We used to have the ineligible services that I went through at the beginning. They've removed that from the Act. They put it in the regulations. Nothing significant as a result of that, other than if the province wants to adjust those services, they just have to put it on the registry for 45 days and you get a change. Where historically, because it's in the Act, it would certainly take much longer. The DC background studies need to examine area rating. It doesn't say that it's only for certain services. It says you have to consider it generally for all. Our recommendations, or us as a firm, we don't feel that anything other than water, wastewater, and storm would be appropriate for looking at on an area-specific basis. A couple of reasons for that, and we've noted in the report. One of the things is there's a limitation in the Act. Let's say I was going to build a recreation facility in another area of town. We're building, and we've got one in a certain area, but we want to build it in this other area, and we wanted to collect it only from that area. We're limited by those service standard calculations to the population times the service standard calculation, which means maybe we're only going to get 50% of that facility. But if we charged it to everybody, we'd be able to collect 100% of that facility. So if you do anything other than water, wastewater, and storm on this very area-rated basis, you're going to end up having to collect money from property taxes. So it's a choice. It's there. But generally, if you've already built an area and they've already benefited, and somebody's continuing to build developments, they've benefited from that investment that's been made in the past, and they should contribute towards expanding the collective service. Annual report of the treasurer, not major. Your treasurer has already made those adjustments. We came forth to all of our clients and made the suggestions on how they should update. Basically, it's just a matter of transparency, giving a little bit more information so the development community are able to read clearer how the money's been spent. No additional levies provision. This has been added, and it can have implications. It's basically said that you as a municipality can't mandatorily charge additional levies that are in addition to the development charge. So you can't make these top-ups just because you feel good about having the development community pay more. So on the one side, that's been addressed in our report. One of the things, the way it's written is it says that you can't charge additional levies or require the construction of certain works that aren't included in the DC. So this is where we get into what's called a local service policy. Back at the beginning, I talked about what the developer's very localized responsibilities are. We've gone through with your past report, and we've just enhanced it. We've enhanced the wording, been more expressive on what the development community should be including as part of their development. So we're trying to minimize the conflict between what their responsibility is and what is in the development chart. So it's not a considerable change. It's really a clarity matter that we're trying to do in that document. So we've clarified that in order to address the change in the Act. An interesting notation, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the minister has dropped in that he wants the power to impose mandatorily area-specific charges. There's no information on there whether they're going to do the calculation, give it to us, whether you have to bring a guy like me back in and start doing these calcs, I don't know. It's just a power for whatever reason they felt important. Maybe it's for significant areas like in Toronto, the waterfront or something. Perhaps that's what it's for, but I just thought I'd mention it. And then there was minor housekeeping changes to the Act, which I don't necessarily need to go over for you. We have mandatory exemptions, so there's certain instances where you can't collect. They're not extensive. Industrial buildings, for an existing building, they can expand up to 50%, and the charge can't be paid on that expansion. There was a good, from my perspective, a good hearing that clarified that this is, for the most part, a one-time exemption. It's not, you keep, doing it in perpetuity. So if you set up the bylaw in the proper way, then it's a one-time expansion, and then you can continue to collect. For low-density housing units, existing housing units, you can add 2 additional apartments, as long as you don't more than double the size of the existing house. And then for medium-density townhouses, high-density apartment buildings, you can add 1 additional unit. And then we have the local government exemption where you can't impose your charges on the school boards or on the region. Similarly, they can't impose, if you build a new recreation center, they can't impose their charges on you. And then the bottom part just identifies that the Act allows you as a council to consider additional exemptions. There may be things that are important to you as part of your community, and you can make within the bylaw reductions or further exemptions. Good example is you can exempt a class, so sometimes we see a reduction or a complete exemption for industrial development, or maybe you don't want to charge target places of worship. So where we don't want to charge place of worship, we'd exempt them from the charge. If the charge is going up considerably, you may wish to consider phasing in over time. So it's either staging it over time or putting the enforcement date 6 months out, these different things. So councils from time to time look to give a little bit of latitude, give a little bit of time for the development community to absorb these adjustments. And the last one just recognizes a redevelopment credit, and that's an example of my house burns down. You should give me a period of time to replace my house. So generally, existing buildings, you can, if you knock them down, you have up to 5 years to replace them. So that's a reasonable period of time. If you're going to come back 15, 20 years later, the exemption's gone. Okay? Just very quickly, what's in your exemptions currently, and what we've continued is listed here. So you've got the Board of Education, municipalities, they're mandatory. The hospitals are eliminated, garden suites, farm help buildings, farm buildings, so bona fide farms. Institutions that are exempt from taxation but follow under different types of legislation, you've exempted. Provincial, federal developments, which because they're higher up in the food chain, you can't collect from them normally anyways. And then there's an exemption for certain types of development in the downtown areas of Fenwick and Font Hill. So we've continued, that was your historic practice, we've continued those in your current bylaw. If you wish to make any further changes to that, eliminate some of those or add, then between now and adoption of the bylaw, we can consider that. As I've noted, a little bit about local service policies. It's summarized in the document, but we're normally talking about including stormwater management as the developer's costs, internal water mains and sewers, and even going off-site to connect up to wherever the major servicing is. In certain cases, even the pumping stations, if it really is very localized to a development, we would include that as part of the cost. Internal roads, sidewalks, street lights, traffic signals, basically included. And lastly, if they're going to dedicate parkland, we would want to see it at a certain quality level when it's dedicated. Maybe sodded, graded, sodded, seeded, fencing, that type of thing. So you hit a minimum level of preparation in turning it over to the municipality. When we develop these charges and when we go through the bylaw process, there's no magic. If with development, as it continues to occur, it puts pressure on municipalities to provide infrastructure. Could be water mains, sewers, could be roads, improvements, etc., fire expansions. So as that occurs, there's pressure for you to build infrastructure. There's not a lot of choices for helping to fund that. The Development Charges Act lets you recover a large portion of it, but the development charge is optional. You don't have to have it as a council. So most municipalities that are growing do have it, but if you don't have the charge, the fallback is to recover it off of property taxes or your water and wastewater rates. So it's something that it's always you as a council need to balance how you do it. And any of your exemptions or whatever, those get funded by property taxes and your water and sewer rates. So it's something you need to consider. For the growth forecast, we've summarized it here. The black on the left-hand side is historic level of building activity. And the red line gives you the average level of activity. You can see in the last couple of years, things have picked up quite well. And the forecast is consistent with the the region's forecast. So we've continued to adopt that. The color coding just identifies that the blue is singles, like the low density. Medium density is the burgundy, and the yellow is high density, your apartments. So it's just giving you a graphical representation of that. If we translate it into numbers over the 10-year planning horizon, it's about 1,500 units and about 3,400 people, and about 500,000 square feet of building space. If we go out 20 years, which we're using for the harder services, you can see we've got about 6,000 people occurring in about 2,700 units. And we've got approaching 900,000 worth of square feet. We do have, for water and wastewater, they are charged on an urban service area. So we don't charge them across all of the municipality, because if you're in the rural area, you're going to put in your own well and septic system. So you do have an area charge for water and wastewater, which is specific to the urban area. And the growth is a little bit less. There is some provision for a little bit of growth activity outside in the rural area. The charges, currently, you can see the services that are listed. The mayor read out these different services. You can see for a single detached unit, it's a little over $14,000. Medium density, which is what we've called multiples here, about $9,800. And then we have apartments, large and small, ranging from about $6,100 to $9,100. The non-residential, so the commercial, industrial, institutional, works out to $6.64. As I've noted, if you're in the rural area, you're going to pay what that line that says municipal wide total. So you're going to pay the non-water wastewater. So you would pay $11,000. If you're in an area that gets water only, then you'll pay the $11,000 plus the $1,276. Okay, so it depends on what services you're receiving. We've continued with the same services as last time, and these are the updated calculations. So we're looking at, for a single detached unit, full services at $16,600. Medium density, about $11,400, and then the large and small ranging from about $7,000 to $11,000. We've also made a provision for special care units. We're seeing across municipalities, retirement homes or seniors' homes that are being specialized developments. So we've provided a charge there, which we've called special care units, in the event that we see some of those buildings arising. Okay? The non-residential's at $8.70. Now, one thing I would note is between the time we released this document, there have been a couple of things that have been mentioned to us. Thank you. There's been a few things mentioned to us. I understand there was a debt schedule that we missed. It would, including that debt schedule, which I think is for water and transportation, including that extra $500,000 in debt charges that have to be paid, would increase the charge by in the range of $225 to $250. So that would be included as part of that. As I understand, there was also an urbanization of a road that needs to be added in. It's about $250,000. So it would add about $125. So right now, a couple of adjustments we need to do would bring us in somewhere in the range $375, $400. I know there were some questions as well on some parks that may have been omitted. If we maxed out on the service standard, I haven't quite got all the information right now, but if we maxed out on the service standard, in theory, that could add another $1,600, $1,700 if we included all these parks and maxed out on it. So I think I need a little bit more direction, but I thought I would bring it up tonight. I can clarify this very shortly and issue an addendum, but because tonight's the public meeting, I wanted the opportunity to give a magnitude of the potential adjustments we may make. Okay. So There was question, this was something that we had talked about during the Pelham Community Center. There's about $12 million in principal that was issued for that facility that would be recovered by DCs. That's net of the 10% deduction, and there's added interest associated with the debt charges. I just wanted to identify, this is a similar schedule that I presented as part of that public process. Some of the councillors may realize or recognize. You can see we've got about over here about $340,000 sitting in the reserve currently. Every time we update the bylaw is good for 5 years, so these are the amounts that we would expect to recover during that 5-year period. So you can see we're approaching $900,000 for the next 5 years. It increases to $2.2 million and then really stabilizes in and around $2.2, $2.3 million for each of the periods. Post 20 years, there's another $3 million recovery. And I haven't blocked it off because it's a little unclear. The region's forecast doesn't take me out all the way. But if you continue along the lines of growth that you're doing right now, you could almost say bank on that $2.2 million every 5 years. I just categorized it like this because it was just, I didn't have exact numbers from the region currently. So if we total all of that, this is the $12 million that you've issued the debt for. So this is the principal, but we'd also add the interest cost on top of that. Just to compare the charges right now, we have for a single detached, we're at a little over $14,000. The calculated charge that's in this document right now is $16,600. If we add those that debt and the that one urbanization project, that will round us up to about $17,000. And if we considered additional park requirements, in theory, that could take us up to $19,000. So once again, I was just putting it on the table. I think for sure we'll be at 17, and then with further direction, consideration, perhaps we're a little bit higher than that. On the non-residential side, we're at $6.64, and we'd be looking at $8.70. Just a quick calc on the corresponding calculations. I think that this would add for water and the road project, I think it'll add about 20 cents roughly per square foot. And then on the, I think the non-residential for the parkland would be 10 cents, something like that. So it's not a considerable adjustment on the non-residential side. The last couple of slides through you, Mr. Mayor, just to demonstrate your charges currently and calculated. So that's in the gray and then the blue, the higher one. You can see that Lincoln and Thorold, or at least the Rolling Meadows part of Thorold, you can see they're at the highest end of the charge. You're moving from a charge which is a little bit lower than the Lincoln Grimsby current charges and be moving up, as I say, above Grimsby there. You can see there's a number of municipalities that are a little bit lower. We are seeing that some of these charges, such as you can see Lincoln, is jumping up quite considerably. So as we're moving ahead, looking at the capital costs, there could be additional costs that are identified. I know the Niagara on the Lake is basically the current versus what's out there. It's a minor change, but they've been stalled on getting me the additional engineering works. So I think that charge will go up as well. So I'm just saying it's something we are seeing coming around this time. The other municipalities that are lower, they haven't come forward yet. So Fort Erie has just issued their tender. Thorold hasn't commenced yet. Welland just awarded their tender, West Lincoln, so we'll see more of those as they come off. Just to point out, in Wainfleet, you can see they're at the bottom, and you say, gee, that's a really good deal. They don't have water and wastewater services. So in addition to that, I know I live in the country. I paid 19 years ago $10,000 for my well and $28,000 for my septic system. So $38,000 in my particular case would have to be added to that $6,500. So if you're looking at municipal water and wastewater versus doing it yourself, it's actually a pretty good deal. On the non-residential side, this is the commercial charges. You can see Lincoln, their proposed charges are in the realm of about $10 to $16 per square foot. Their current charge is at $8.27. You can see that Niagara-on-the-Lake and Grimsby are in and around your calculated charge. So you'd be moving from that $6.64 up to that $8.70 realm. You see, once again, everybody is below your current lines. And then on an industrial basis, very similar patterns. There is an adjustment for Lincoln. They currently don't charge, so they've got a reduction for that. So they're not at the top like they were at commercial. This one would, for industrial purposes, put you towards the top end. One thing I'd note is that for industrial, the region has an industrial charge, but then they also have grants that they provide to offset the charge. So even though it's technically it's on there, they have an offsetting revenue contribution to developing landowners. That concludes my remarks, Mr. Mayor, and as I say, we'll probably very shortly issue an addendum that'll be available on the website and to anyone who signs up, and then we'll be back for your consideration on July 16th.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation. As per the agenda that we have, normally I would say, does council have any questions? But as per the agenda that was outlined, we actually open that up after we hear from the public. So I'm going to, I don't know that the clerk is, Madam Clerk, you're saying I do this now, but I want council to ask questions first and public before we do that. So I'm going to open it up to members of the public.
Okay.
If there's any input from members of the public, we would appreciate that. And if you could, jumping up, look at that. If you could say your name and address for the record, and good evening.
Good
Thank
evening,
you for
Mr. Mayor,
coming.
members of council, staff. My name's Stephen Kaiser. I live at 1541 Hay Street in Fonthill. I was here tonight to speak in regards to some costs we're incurring on development we're doing on Lookout Street adjacent the driving range in regards to urbanization of the street. Mr. Scanlon's already spoke to that, so I'm satisfied with that. We've been working with staff behind the scenes. We've agreed on what is DC eligible, and it's just those costs weren't incorporated into the background study. So I believe I have agreement from the Director of Planning and the Director of Public Works in terms of what we've been working on.
Thanks. What are those? I'm just confused. What are those costs? If you can fill council in.
Well, it's an existing road that's being urbanized, so it's those costs to urbanize the existing road that are, that we're paying our portion, and there's a portion attributed to the town. Just as similar as in the DC you see to urbanize, be it Port Robinson Road or Station Street in this current bylaw, that same allotment of costs.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Kaiser? I guess my question would be, and staff will consider this, how does this interrelate with the development agreement that we just recently approved from this council, which included sidewalks and light standards and things like that for that area? So when we'll look forward to that
Discussion.
coming back.
Okay, good. Maybe if I could add some general comments?
Sure.
I'm not here to oppose the bylaw. I was just thinking as I sat back there, I've been talking about development charges since I started as president of the Niagara Home Builders Association back in 1990, and all the way up to president of the Urban Development Institute, where we work with Gary and Cam Watson from his firm in terms of the new development charges bylaw that the Minister of then Municipal Affairs and Housing, Al Leach, wanted to come forward with. And we undertook AMO and our organization to work over the winter months to try and come up with a piece of legislation that would work. And we almost got there in terms of just a couple of items. But DCs is always a tough thing. I mean, we as an industry, we say growth should pay its fair share. And it's always tough to figure out what exactly is gross fair share. I mean, we look at the cumulative charges you see on the chart, then you throw in park dedication on top of that. And I know the lots that we're developing will be at $50,000 before we even get a building, go for the building permit charge. So it does all add up and is looked at incrementally. So I think, Gary, you know, what we said, one of the things, it's always when you look at a line item in a DC, and that's how they're all added up. But you take something like, and you look in the road section to urbanize Station Street from Port Robinson Road to Highway 20, the capital costs and then the apportionment of the capital costs. That's the real decider in the incremental in terms of what up and ups those costs. And it's finding out what exactly is gross fair share and the benefit to existing ratepayers. So it's a Herculean task. I know I'm not here in opposition to what's before you today. I just was here to speak in regards to that specific point. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kaiser. Appreciate that. Any further questions or any questions by members of council? Thank you for your feedback. Are there any other members of the public that are present that would like to give some feedback to council on the proposed, and the background study that's before us? Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate that feedback and members of the public being here. Thank you. Now I'll open it up to questions from council. To Mr. Scanlon. Are there any questions? Councillor Papp, thanks for leading us off. Go ahead.
Just very quickly through to Mr. Scanlon, I wouldn't mind, maybe I missed it, I'm very curious about the definition of the special care dwellings, what that means. So you don't know if you could send me clarification, because we are in the midst of, we just sold some property that is going to incorporate some of those components. And I think I'd be curious to know, and I think we'll probably be seeing more of that type of development. So in my world where I was, special care meant something different, not different, but I just want to see if there's similarities. That's my only request. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any others? Councillor Durley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You did mention, Mr. Scanlon, the other municipalities that seem to be lower than us right now have not yet updated. When is their time frame to update? Is it just pretty well the same as ours, or we're jumping ahead of the gate?
You're just a little bit ahead. A lot of their bylaws are going to expire at the end of the summer next year.
Okay.
So we will see you, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Lincoln will basically all pass on the same evening. So your bylaws are a little bit earlier. They're getting caught up with the elections and then being able to have the public meeting and a reasonable amount of time to be able to do everything. It's a little bit tight. So you've been actually moved forward a little bit. They've got a little bit more leg room. So they're going to look to come forward a little bit later, but they're going to have a tight process as well.
So in fact, the rankings will change as they update.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Councillor Kersey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a number of questions, if I may.
Go ahead, please.
Through you. Gary, Mr. Kaiser alluded to something that I was going to ask about, and that is, how do you quantify the benefit to existing? Could you expand on that?
Benefit to existing always is in relation to individual projects. So, and there's a number of different things that guide us. If we're, say, replacing a 5,000 square foot fire station with a 10,000 square foot, then the first half of that building is a replacement. And then the second half of it's expanding to probably acquire additional, bays for the fire station and stuff. So number one, in buildings, quite often it's the it's the nature of the expansion that we take into consideration. When you get into water storage, it could be a matter if you've got deficiencies in fire flows in an area. We'd say, when you build into this new tower, the first 15% is to overcome the deficiency you have in fire flows. So the calculation says you should have this. So in that particular case, we'd be looking at deducting 15%. If we're replacing a water main that may be an 8-inch and we're putting in a 12-inch, then we'd be generally taking a look at the replacement cost of the existing pipe versus the expanded cost of the new pipe. Now, on the existing cost of the cost of the existing pipe, we'll make some adjustments. If I put that pipe in 5 years ago and I should have got 100 years out of it, I'm not going to deduct the full cost of the pipe. So I may deduct maybe 5 to 10% of the replacement cost of the existing size. So of the total project, I end up only deducting from that calculation. When I'm looking at roads, it depends whether you're adding lanes. And if I'm just adding lanes, but I'm not really affecting the 2 existing lanes, it wouldn't be a significant deduction because I'm not doing much. If you're going to do a complete reconstruct, the deduction may be higher. So there's a lot of different measures that we have, and it depends on the nature of the project, what you're changing, how are you changing it, what are you trying to address. So that's where I come back to number 1, is there existing deficiencies that you're trying to address in that calculation or not? Is it a replacement? Or maybe there's a change in legislation, so we're forced to do something, and so that would include it. So that's about the best I can get. I can give you something I gave to the ministry, because the ministry wanted to actually write something into the legislation on benefit to existing, and I gave them, I think, 17 examples. And I said, I was trying to say, try and write this, because, the way you look at it is so distinct, because it's very project specific. So if you want more examples, I can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, that provides some clarity there. In Appendix B, we're talking about quality and quantity and the cost per capita and what have you. How is it that you determine the cost per capita? That's a derivation of costs that have been incurred over the previous bylaw?
Exactly. Even further back. The Act basically says what we charge the developers in the future can be no higher than the average level of service we've provided over the past 10 years. And you must take into consideration quality and quantity. So let's take it in steps. So I have to go back 10 years, and I list the infrastructure that you have. So you may have had, going back 10 years ago, let's say you had one fire facility, 10,000 square feet. I move forward 5 years, you build another one, but it's 5,000 square feet. And then the last 2 years, we added one more bay to that first. So what the Act wants you to do is take a look at the change over time in the assets that you're providing. So we normally use square feet because it's, in this particular case, an easy measure. We can bring out construction cost manuals and generally be able to identify it. Then on top of it, we add land cost, we add site servicing, because obviously you have to landscape it, put water and sewer pipes in there, or maybe if it's outside, septic water systems, you need a parking lot, etc. So we build with these quality, quantity, we then build those costs up. What you don't see on these sheets is whether we then take that cost per square foot, which is replacement cost in today's dollars, okay? And then we multiply it by those buildings, and then now we get all this dollar value.
Right.
And in each year, we divide it by the population that's there. And we take the census for the 2 periods, we look at the building permits, and we do an estimate of what the population is based on those 2 time horizons and the building activity that's occurred. So we try and be as precise as possible.
Right.
And then it's math. The Act, we do that calculation each and every year. The Act says total up those costs per capitas for the 10 years and divide by 10, and there's the dollar amount.
Okay.
So that's as simple as I can get, but that's what we have to do.
I now understand why that detail wasn't in this report.
I'd be more than happy next time to include everyone for you. But that's generally what it is. And it doesn't apply, once again, to water, wastewater, storm.
Right.
Obviously, after Walkerton, what you need to provide in your situation, top quality water that meets the legislation, that's the cost.
Yep.
Same thing with sewers and even with storm.
Thank you.
If I may continue, in Appendix C, where we're talking about long-term capital and operating cost examination. And this is sort of an important thing for future planning and maintaining reserves and building reserves and what have you. So I really would like to get a fairly clear understanding of it. And you talk about in your preamble about how you look at the sinking fund valuation, and you've come up with these life cycle cost factors.
Yes.
How are they determined?
So that's the water linear, 80 years,
Yes.
facilities 50,
Yes.
roads 30. Okay.
Yes.
If you recall, when I've been before you with your water and your sewer studies, your rate studies, we go through a process and we identify the operating costs. So we estimate, the cost to run the systems, And then we take a look at your planned expenditures, maybe for expansion and such. So we add that into the capital budget. And then as an added thing, we look at all your existing infrastructure. And then with the infrastructure, we then take a look at how many years useful life is left. And we do a calculation. If that water main is going to be replaced in 20 years, how much do I need to put into a bank every year? It'll grow at 2% or whatever, so that it'll reach the inflated cost 20 years from now.
Right.
So we've applied the exact same calculation in here. We've looked at the water mains or sewers, we've applied an average useful life, and we've done the same thing. If you want to have the money in there and you can invest, you'll have that money to replace that asset. And that's the approach that's been adopted for this particular schedule. Is something that the Act says that you must consider it. Nothing turns on it. In fact, it only talks about, look at the expenditures. It doesn't tell you about the offsetting revenue or anything.
Right.
So we comply with the Act by putting this information forward.
So these factors that are in here, so for example, water linear is 80-year average useful life period.
Yes.
The factor is a great long number.
Yes.
Is that arrived at statistically over many municipalities and then applied to our municipality?
Nope. It would be as simple as if I need to have $1, so this is actually based on $1. So if I needed to replace $1 worth of infrastructure 80 years from now,
Yep.
and I'm gonna put an amount in the bank every year, and it's gonna compound at whatever my investment rate is, then you need to put, this represents less than a half a cent per year. So if you put half a cent per year in the bank every year and invest it, at the end of 80 years, you're gonna have $1.
Right.
Okay, but if you took half a cent times 80, you're only gonna get 40 cents. Right? But with the interest, the compound, you'll get the eventual $1. So we're trying, depreciation just takes whatever your cost is and divide it by 80 years.
Right.
If you did that and put the money in the bank, you'd have a ton of money, way more. So this calculation is more of an investment. It's called a sinking fund.
Yeah.
And
Okay, so it's taking into consideration growth within the fund and,
Yes.
I see.
If I wanted to retire 20 years from now and have $1 million, how much do I need to put in the bank every year? And my financial advisor will invest it, and I'll have $1 million. That's exactly what this calculation is meant to do.
Okay.
So, in the body of the report, you say you take the factor and you multiply it by the capital asset cost.
Correct.
So if I turn to table C1, if I'm boring anybody, but I need to understand this. And the gross cost benefit to existing is 10,441,000, life cycle expenditures of 614. Is that factor then multiplied by the gross benefit to
That's,
existing, or?
no, that already has been multiplied through.
Okay, so this,
So we've taken, if you go back to the capital cost sheets, where we
Right.
identify the projects,
right,
and you pull the growth-related amount, and
Right.
multiply it by this factor, you should come up with that.
okay,
So if I'm gonna invest $10 million, then from a life cycle perspective, I then need to put X number of dollars away each and every year.
right. So if we as a council are wanting to maintain our reserves, and if I look down the sheet, we need to be contributing out of the tax levy off the operating budget as a transfer to reserves, a minimum of 2,574,000,
Yes.
right? And at least, and we're maintaining. If we want to grow anything over and above that, we would see growth within our reserves if our projections are correct in what we're spending.
Correct.
Okay.
And coming up soon, your treasurer will take you through all of this as part of the infrastructure for jobs and prosperity. We have to move towards an asset management calculation.
Right.
So then they'll be taking a look at that type of calculation as a measure, and looking at your 10-year budget, what you need to invest. And maybe you only have to replace $1 million right now,
Right.
but maybe you want to put $2.5 million away, so you'll be replacing some of the assets and then building for the future. But that's something that the treasurer will draw you through during that
That
process.
makes perfect sense. And two more questions, if I may. In the bylaw, we talk about redevelopment. And I get the idea of credits, and that's legislated with a demolition. Are the timelines legislated as well, or are the timelines within the purview of the local municipality? Because 5 years to me seems a long period. I can see going back 5 years, but holding that as a liability to the municipality, to the corporation, for 5 more years seems excessive to me.
It's not dealt with in the legislation. Where it comes from is case law, going to the OMB. So that over many years, the first case was actually in 1992, City of London, and it said you had to do it, but it didn't have any time horizons on it. So it almost meant in perpetuity you have to recognize, so somebody comes, with a picture from 1840 and says there was a house here, give me a credit.
Right.
So that was a little unreasonable, and over time, there's been further OMB hearings just to define this. So the 4 or 5 years is your choice. In certain instances, I've seen it longer, but only in a select few. And 4 or 5 years is the norm, and that's been embraced through the legislation, the case law.
And just to add to that, the region considered this when it looked at its development charge bylaw, based on a couple of cases, one of them on the industrial side, because I think it was the Ferenti Packard plant came to the region and said, we're up to the 5 years, we're right up against it. We demolished, the first thing we did was demolish the buildings, and then we had to clean up the site. And then we had to develop it and sell it and do all those other things, and we're right at the 5 years. So council in that time said, well, then we'll extend it a certain period of time, and then we considered in our bylaw whether for industrial purposes, we needed to almost do a bit of a discount. So maybe at year 6 it goes to 80, and at year 7 it goes to 60 or 40 or whatever that is. So that would be the logical case when it comes to a brownfield development and giving those credits. I don't know of many industrial properties that we have here, although we did have the request last summer, I think, for the former Mazda dealership to extend that because, again, the building was demolished at a certain period of time, et cetera. So I think the way it's maybe clarified, the way it's written now, a proponent that would bump up against that would have to come to council. Is that correct?
Yes, unless through this discussion, you want to address that in certain situations, industrial, brownfield, at the approval of council, we will allow for this staging.
Yeah.
It should be written in the bylaws so there's clarity, but that's where there's further adjustments. If you wish me to consider, then I'll take your direction.
I'm not suggesting that, I'm just helping the councilor out. I'm not sure of many situations in which we might need it in our municipality. So, okay, thank you, and thanks for letting me
No problem.
give you some info from the regional side. Go ahead, Gary.
Another question that I have, so if we're gonna give credits, that becomes a liability to the municipality. Is that recognized as a net out in the reserves, or how is that recognized on our financial statement?
It's one of those credits that you don't have to fund
I
at
see.
all. Because if I'm knocking down a house and I'm putting another house up, there's no change from a service perspective. Generally, it should be using the same amount of water, you
Right.
know. If it burns down, fire department's gonna respond. If I'm gonna have a non-residential, strip mall that's 10,000 square feet, I'm gonna tear it down, I'm now gonna put an office building, then the first 10,000 square feet is replacement. You give them a credit, but you don't have to fund that type of credit. Redevelopment credits aren't funded, because all it is replacing, in theory, a service level that's already there.
Right.
So they're gonna absorb that first, and then pay for the, service increase,
So it's a non-cash liability,
non-cash liability.
okay, okay.
Can I just add, there's a challenge in, an issue in some parts of Niagara, specifically Niagara Falls. I can think of one case where there was a school that was built and used and sold. So the school didn't pay development charges, and then it's converted over into something else, a commercial entity, I believe is what it was. And so the question was, do they get a credit because no development charges were paid? And if they do, what was the, I forget how that all settled down, but it's a bit of an issue, or maybe it's still ongoing, I don't know. He's smiling, so you may not want to give us the answer.
I think it's still ongoing.
Still ongoing.
We'll leave it at that.
But, you know, those are, I think, the issue. So if, maybe you can add, what happens when there's a change? We had a situation where, I guess it's a change of use, right? I can think of, there's a construction company up here in Uptown Fawn Hill. They moved into a house. Conceivably, they could have demolished the house and put up a building, but it was a house. So do they get credit for the residential or the commercial?
If they activate, it's normally what was there when the conversion occurred.
Right.
Okay? So if I had a single-family home and now I'm converting it to an industrial building, then you take the industrial times the square footage minus the single-family home. So that's, it's always what was there is a deduction relative to what the new use is. So maybe you knock down 3 single-family homes, build 10 townhouses, then it's 10 townhouses times the medium density rate, less the 3 times single family. So that's the formula.
Thank you.
I have one last question. if I
Okay.
may. And I think you may have addressed
Try
it,
not to
but.
comment on it.
But- So if we choose to exempt a specific class of property, do you then go back and do a recalculation and reapportion those dollars that we would have collected if we had not created the exemption? Because if you don't, it leaves the municipality in a shortfall.
I'm an economist, so I'll say yes and no. Okay? If you wanted to have an exemption, like right now, we've calculated non-residential. So industrial, commercial, and institutional are the exact same rate. Okay, that's what, the non-res means. So, if you're, what was the question? If you're exempting one and then putting in another?
Yeah, can we roll it back over the other
Yeah,
classes?
can we take that cost and then put it on the backs of somebody else? No.
Okay.
There's different methodologies for calculating. We can separate the commercial, the industrial, and institutional, and develop a cost per employee, because in the calculations, in effect, that's what happens. But you get different you get different buildings. An industrial building may have 1,500 square feet for every employee, but a commercial building may have only 500 square feet. So it may come down to, we've got $1,000 per employee, and if I divide it by the commercial rate, I got $1,000 divided by 500, I end up with $2. If I do the $1,000 divided by 1,500 square feet, I end up with something like 75 cents. So I can do that. The methodology will allow me to do it, But you'd still, even though I do that calculation, you'd have to pay
thanks,
for
Richard.
the 75 cents.
Right, so you
So
still
I
would,
can change the calculations a little bit, but the act is very specific, it's the cross-subsidization. I can't take the money I'm not gonna collect here and then put it on the backs of somebody else.
I see. Okay, thank you, thanks very much.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else with questions? Okay, I have some questions. I did provide these to you in advance, and you answered them, but I just wanted to make sure that council, and I won't raise them all, but the council knows. If we can go to indoor recreation, and maybe the historical spend piece, and maybe you can clarify this. So the way I understand the historical spend is, and you described it earlier, but if there's something that may not be here, and there was more money spent than what's in this study, it actually increases that, or potentially could increase it, and then therefore there could be more recovered in earlier years.
Yeah, it depends whether it's a spend or if we've done a building and you've improved that building.
Right.
Then in theory, the replacement cost should reflect those improvements that you've done. If we've missed a building on the property, we've missed 2,000 square feet, we should include that, and that would increase the service standard. So if if I have an arena and I go in and I renovate
Right,
certain areas of
which
it,
I was thinking of.
then my replacement cost should reflect the upgrades that have been done in the past. So instead of putting a replacement cost of $200 per square foot, maybe I've used $210 a square foot to reflect that upgrade.
And does that, so a specific example would be, I didn't see it here, a number of years ago, I think it was in the fall of 2012, council will recall that we spent some dollars, probably about $115,000 to reinforce the, I'll say, existing arena because the walls were collapsing and we almost had to close it. And I think we did on one windy day. So if that were included as the service standard piece, in theory, does that then mean that when your calculation came out for the new community center, that could go up slightly in terms of the recoverable amount?
For the existing building, I've costed it as one that would not fall down. So I'm using a higher value as a replacement cost currently. So I have embraced that increase
Okay.
in value. As you saw the stepping up of the
Right.
recovery for recreation, that's to reflect as that building comes into service, your service standard will increase over time, allowing us to collect more.
Okay, so it's for the new building, not for
The
the old
new
building?
building will, when I keep doing these
Yeah.
calculations, 5 years from now, and then 10 years from now, 15, those service standards will change. And I'll be able to take more money to pay the debt charges.
Okay.
So they'll be-
But is it related, like the other one was the trailers that we put at the existing facility? And there were dollars that were spent, I forget how much that was.
I don't think, well, see, there's one where I did not include the trailers. It was omitted
Yeah.
in our dialogue with staff.
Okay.
I think I did a quick calculation. I think I said if it was, if those trailers were worth $100,000, it could have an effect of increasing the charge by $20. So if I missed $100,000 worth of
Okay,
space, that would
okay.
bring it up.
So
by
I don't know
$20.
if staff need to include that or not, and they can look back on the records on the value for those trailers.
I'm making some other adjustments, so I'll probably say here at the public meeting, I will make that adjustment, so another $20 would be arising from that inclusion.
In terms of, unless there's anybody else on the indoor recreation, I'd like to turn to outdoor recreation. And that's the parks, which is 518. There's a couple of parks here. So I look at number 11. Some of this is carryover, I think, from the previous study, but there's a longboard skate park, which we included in the study, and that was at 143,000. And there really wasn't, there was sort of a push for it a bunch of years ago, and I just wonder if maybe that should be removed, because it doesn't seem that there's appetite for that currently.
So that's project 11.
Project 11.
We had $143,000 for 2024, so
Yeah.
six years from now. I'm at your pleasure.
I think it's something that maybe staff can get back to you on, whether we should include that or not, but my understanding is that we put it in there as a potential, and there's been no sort of uptake on it, right? Maybe this can be clear, I looked at this because it's above it, but number 10, the parking lot, I don't know if that was in relation to Project 11, but it says it's in 2020, but we just did part of it. That's probably the new parking lot around the gravel parking lot, is that correct? I don't know if you. Page 519.
The MSSP.
That's probably the gravel parking lot, so that's probably
I
okay.
think that is.
Yeah.
Taking that from gravel.
The director didn't know that, I apologize. Okay, that,
We can get back to you. If we don't have it at our fingertips, I can
Okay.
respond.
it's probably that, it's the gravel part, not the, because we just did pave part of it. The other question is I see that there's an East Fon Hill Parkland Development, $500,000. East Fenwick Parkland Development, almost double that. But I didn't see what we call the Wooner for the central square piece in that. I didn't know whether that was an allowable piece. So that's the piece outside of the community center, the Wellspring. Okay, so maybe,
Part of that property.
and that's what you
development.
alluded to earlier, is when
Yes.
you, okay.
So if we've missed this, I don't have the costing.
Yeah,
I think you.
I don't know that we have
pointed-
the costing either, but,
Yeah, you pointed out two, so
Yeah.
I'll work with staff. As I say, if it was something up to $2.8 million, I can rationalize it. If it's more than that, I can't go past
Okay.
that amount, but we'll have an opportunity to chat.
okay,
And
that's
then that's where I
perfect.
say, if it was that full $2.8 million, you could see the charge going up by $1,690 per unit.
Yeah,
If these two projects you pointed out are an extra $1 million, then it's roughly 1/3 of that.
okay. Well, the one, I think the one is the Central Park, that's the East Fon Hill Parkland Development, that's, I said there's two projects, so, but the other is what we call the Wooner for the public square, so,
We'll look into that.
okay, perfect. Anyone else on the parkland? Okay. The transit, and you did give a response on this, but the report does say that transit doesn't apply, but we do have a system, and your response was that your understanding is it's a pilot project.
Yeah, I think, number one, we probably misspoke. We didn't articulate correctly, but I understood that it's a pilot project initially, so that we were waiting to see what ultimately, once you complete that, what would be the program that you're looking for, is to have some insight. But transit's now, may I take a moment?
Yeah, please. I was going to ask you about this because it's different than everything else.
Yeah, those service standards that we talked about, the historic, we spent a lot of time doing that calculation. Transit is now a forward-looking service standard. And what that means is they want to give you, if you had no service right now, and under the old rules, if you went to provide transit, you've got no service right now, so your historic 10 years is zero, so you're not getting anything. And that's not fair. If you're trying to take people, so you're not expanding more roads and putting that cost in the DC, you would think that you should be able to collect some money, so it's an offset. So what they said is, okay, what you need is a forward-looking service standard. And for the most part, what that means is, number one, you're now providing the service, which technically you are. But we need to figure out what's your target that you're looking for. So quite often through a transportation master plan, They'll go, okay, you know, with this amount, we're gonna grow by 10,000 people, and that's gonna generate another 5,000 trips per day. Now, those trips can either be in cars, and everybody's driving. They'll make some allocation for bicycles, walking, stuff like that. With transit, you also have to identify that right now we're going from a nominal, or let's say in theory a 0, but we want to target to go to 5% or 10%. We want, of those new 5,000 trips, we want to put, 10% of those butts
In the seats,
into the
right.
seats. Now I've got some parameters under the new act that I can do some calculations. So I think what I was trying to express to you in my correspondence was, once you're satisfied that this is a service we're moving ahead with, we need to rationalize how are we dealing with roads versus transit or versus AT, alternative transportation
yeah.
measures. So,
Okay, that's perfect. And that can be done anytime, you said.
yes.
I think
can-
as well,
I
so it can be sort of-
revisit the bylaw.
Okay,
anytime.
and I think there is a transportation master plan in the document later on in the roads portion. So that's something that council should consider in the future when we look at it, the modality of transportation. The,
And
on
the-
that, Councillor Pat?
On the
Oh,
transportation.
yeah, please, go ahead.
The fact
Transit?
is that we received a 5-year, $500,000 more to continue on, so it's almost like, it's a given, we have to map out the plan, make sure we get the projections correctly, so that we can, whether it's rolling stock, buying stock with it, so I'm not gonna leave it at that. So we've been pretty well, the ministry has recognized us as a very viable type of area, so you're right, Mr. Mayor, so we might as well start planning for that now.
And as I say, I think it's something that with the transportation master plan, those are the numbers. You've got
Right.
transportation engineers that are rationalizing how you're gonna accommodate the growth. They're gonna look at where is it located, where are the jobs, are they going out of the city, are there people coming into or out of the municipality in? So they'll rationalize that, and from that, they'll slice and dice it and say 80% or 70% in cars, X number of percent by bicycles and
Right.
such, and then X number by buses, or whatever your transit mode is.
Thank you. Two other quick things, I hope. The report talks about discounted interest versus interest,
Yes,
or there's interest and then it's discounted.
okay.
What's the rationale for that?
When you're paying debt charges, normally those payments are exactly the same every year. And everybody knows, because of your mortgage, every payment, you get a little bit more principal, a little bit less interest. But you have one payment. When I look at that stream of payments, I have to recognize that we're going to index your bylaw. There's a provision to keep it current with inflation. So next year, in theory, I'm going to adjust it by 2%, the next year another 2%, another 2%. So what we have to do is take that stream of payments that are equal, and because your bylaw is increasing, I have to discount the payments so that it brings it back
That's
into
fair.
balance. As every year you're adding the interest, it's kind of
Yeah,
adjusting those
okay.
payments back to the original amount.
That seems quite complicated, but very fair to the development industry, so thank you for explaining that. Thank you. And then the other is in terms of the date for doing this in force. I know when we looked at our development charge bylaw 4 years ago, some of the development industry was looking for a longer period in which to retool. So in theory, if somebody was, their payments, they're selling a house, and in that house price, they have whatever it is for development charges, and now it's gonna increase $2,000. We wanna maybe give them sort of a heads up to say, by the way, on whatever date it is. So I didn't know, maybe we could consider the date in which this would come into force, even though it might be approved in July, let's hope.
Yep.
Maybe it doesn't go into force until September 15th or October 1st or September 1st.
Because your
whatever that is.
bylaw, your current bylaw doesn't die,
Yeah,
so it can continue in force, and we'll shut it down on the day that you want to activate this one. So the enforcement date and the repeal date of the current bylaw would then be whatever date you set. So as long as we're still within the useful life of your current bylaw,
Okay.
I can adjust it to whatever date
Okay,
you wish.
so I would maybe ask the treasurer to sort of, and everybody involved, all the staff, to just think about the time that you might recommend to council in order to trigger that change from the one bylaw to the other, with being fair to the development industry as they are trying to promote their product.
I'm
Okay.
happy to do that.
Thank you. Thanks, council. Those were my questions. I didn't know if any councilors had any further questions or comments. Councilor Papp, go ahead.
Just quickly through you. So actual 60 days started on May 17th,
That's correct?
right? So public, it's been out there. I apologize, it's been on the website, so they know that. Population projection always fascinates me. The population's based on what you've been able to get off Census Canada, right?
The starting population.
Right. And where I'm going with this is, at some point, when you do projections being involved in another field, we like to also look at demographics, like who's actually coming, what their age groups are. And we've heard some, I could say, different versions of what our percentage of our population would look like, because it will have an impact on our growth.
Right.
So part of it is, I think we need to keep in line also with what public health, what are they projecting, what planning is. So that's something that I think we should monitor carefully, because I know you gave us, it's 5,000, 6,000, 8,000. Who are these? You
And
know?
there's two different ways of doing the
Right.
projections. There's housing demand, which
Right.
is one we use,
Right.
and we use persons per unit.
Right.
And that's based on your actual data, and we are able to look at the age of units and look at the population in the
Right.
newer units versus the old. The other one's called a cohort,
Right.
and that's where you go in and you start distributing the age and doing the weighting.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
We haven't done that, but I'm sure the others that you're referring to have done the cohort.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the cohort, because that also is a part of our whole, trying to analyze like what's the municipality gonna look like, what are we doing? But I'll leave it at that. I'm just, that's why I was asking you about the actual numbers.
And just to be clear, we don't use the cohort because there's some less specific things when it relates to building permits. So
Right.
cohorts don't necessarily translate into building permits.
Right, they don't.
So that's why we use the housing demand one, because you're charging when these buildings are being created.
Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Going once, twice, three times? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for answering council's questions and for looking into some of those items for us and getting back to us. So thank you very much, Mr. Scanlon, and your colleague as well from Watson and Associates. It has been moved. Now, I need a new mover because Councilor Ribbiak had to go to another session, so Councilor Papp. It's been moved by Councilor Papp, second by Councilor Durley. Be it resolved, the council received the development charges bylaw overview presentation by Watson and Associates Economists Limited, and staff proceed with the preparation of a development charge bylaw for consideration by council on July 16th, 2018. Any other comments or questions? Going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. Moved by Councilor Durley, seconded by Councilor Papp. Be it resolved, the council received the following correspondence related to the proposed 2018 development charge bylaw, the Welland Pelham Chamber of Commerce. Questions or comments to that correspondence? We certainly appreciate the correspondence by the chamber, talking about they're always cautious for fees in business development, but they're saying that there doesn't appear to be that many adverse effects at this time. I'm going to call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. That motion is carried. Next is the closing of the public meeting. Having heard all the comments from the public, this public meeting is now closed. Council will urge the public to submit their comments in writing prior to July 11th, and we hope it'll come earlier than that. Council consideration on the development charge bylaw is scheduled to occur on July 16th, 2018. So it has been moved by Councilor Kersey, second by Councilor Papp. Be it resolved, the following bylaw be read a first, second, third time passed, being bylaw 4005, to adopt, ratify, and confirm the proceedings of the Council of the Town of Pelham at its special meeting held on the 13th day of June 2018. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. And it's been moved by Councillor Kersey, second by Councillor Lane. Be it resolved, the special meeting of council be adjourned until the next regular meeting scheduled for June 18th, 2018. All those in favor? Any opposed? That motion carries. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.